Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. The title advertised was The Amazing Quran. I would suggest first of all that to call the Quran amazing is something that isn't done simply by Muslims who may have an appreciation for the Quran and are very pleased with it, but the book has been called amazing by non-Muslims. Non-Muslims, in fact people who are very filled with dislike for Islam, have still been surprised at the Quran. They've been amazed at what it has to say. So that is some of what I wanted to talk about. One thing that surprises the non-Muslim, those who are examining the book very carefully, is that the Quran does not appear to be what they would expect. What they know is they have an old book. It comes from 14 centuries ago in the Arabian desert. So they expect that the book should look something like that. It should look like an old book from the desert. And then they find out that it doesn't resemble what they expect. One of the first things that some people notice is that if you have a book that's old and it comes from the desert, it should talk about the desert. And the Quran does. Some of its imagery concerns the desert. But it also talks about the sea, what it's like to be in a storm on the sea. In fact, some years ago, the story came to us in Toronto of a man who was in the merchant marine. So he made his living on the ocean, and somebody gave him a copy of the Quran to read. A Muslim gave him a translation to read. He knew nothing about the history of Islam, but he was interested. When he finished reading the book, he brought it back to the Muslim who gave it to him, and he said, this Muhammad, was he a sailor? Because he was impressed at how it described so perfectly a storm on the sea. When he was told no, as a matter of fact, he lived in the desert, this was enough for the man. He embraced Islam on the spot. He was so impressed. Because he'd been in a storm. He knew that who wrote this has been in a storm on the ocean, because of the description of waves within waves and the darkness between them, the precise description. It's not what somebody imagines a storm is like on the ocean, it's what somebody knows a storm is like on the ocean. So this is one indication of the kind of thing I'm getting at, that the book doesn't seem to be tied to a certain time and place from the desert 14 centuries ago. The scientific ideas expressed also don't seem to originate from 14 centuries ago. Many centuries before that, there was a theory, well known, of atomism, which was advanced by the Greeks. Democritus in particular was the man's name, who lived about 23 centuries ago. Democritus and the people who came after him assumed that matter comes in a smallest piece, the atom. The Arabs used to deal in that same concept, and the word in Arabic, zarra, an atom, commonly meant that. It's the smallest piece of matter. Now modern science finds out that yes, there is an atom, there's the smallest unit of matter which still has the same characteristics as the element, but that atom comes apart too. That was a new idea. That's a development of this last century. Interestingly enough, that doesn't outdate the Quran, because we have an interesting statement which is usually missed in any translation of the Quran, in an ayah that mentions the tiniest pieces of things, and it mentions this dharra, saying an atom or anything smaller than an atom. Now 14 centuries ago, that sentence would look unusual even to an Arab, because to him, dharra, that was the bottom. It's the smallest things get. The Quran mentions that in fact Allah is aware of everything down to the dharra and anything smaller. So the book is not outdated. Another example of what we might expect to find in an old book is what you will find in virtually any old book that comes near to the subject of health or medicine. Various historical sources tell us that the Prophet of Islam was very concerned with health and hygiene, very concerned with cleanliness. That was his reputation. So you would think that if you have a book which originates in his head, it should talk about medicine. That if you have this disease, you should try this. If this makes you ill, try some of this. Because history reports he had a lot of opinions on the subject. He had a lot of ideas about if this is your disease, this might be your cure. A lot of opinions that way. But none of them are in the Quran. There's no home remedies in the Quran that could be outdated. In fact, the Quran only mentions one item which is not in dispute by anybody. It mentions honey, saying that in honey there's a healing. Something there is that's good in honey. I don't think anyone will argue with that. But it does not contain any of a man's opinions about what is beneficial, what's the best food to eat, or what is healthiest for you, what will cure this or that disease. Another item that can we turn this down just a little bit? Another item that you might also expect to find, if you assume this book is the product of a man's mind, is it should reflect some of what is going on in his mind. In fact, if you look up in certain encyclopedias, various books, the subject of Islam, many books will tell you that the Quran was a product of the hallucinations that this man had. Well, if that's true, if it originated in some psychological problems going on in his mind, it should look like that. But does it? What kinds of things do you suppose went on in his mind and his heart? He had a very difficult life. He had 3 sons who died as infants. All of his daughters except one died before him. He had a wife of several years who must have been quite a woman, because in fact when the first revelation came to him, he ran home to his wife afraid. I suggest to you that even today you'll have a hard time finding an Arab who will tell you, I was so afraid I ran home to my wife. Won't be likely to say that. But that's how influential and strong a woman she apparently was. She died. Does the Quran mention any of these things? The death of his children, his wife? Never. Never discusses these things. And yet they must have been the things that hurt him and tortured him, caused him pain and grief through his whole life. They never show up in this book, which is supposed to originate in his tortured mind. So I've just given so far some examples of how the Quran contains what you don't expect it to contain, and it's missing what you might expect should be there. A really scientific approach to the Quran is possible because the Quran offers something that is not offered by religious scriptures, generally speaking. Religions don't offer this. It's what the scientist demands. Let me explain to you what I mean. You see, today there are any number of people who have ideas about how the universe works. They have theories.